So thanks everyone for coming to this third part in our 5-part series. If you missed the last two, they are recorded and up on YouTube. So you can get that link, I believe from Nicole. And the series and the topics are all sort of interrelated, but they are also watchable one by one. So if you've missed the first two, it's not like you're going to be lost, but I may be referring back to things that we've talked about before. So if you ever want to check those out, they are available. And today we're going to be talking about healthy relationships and support networks. So both how to sort of assess the health of the relationships in your own life, and then also how to support people in your life who might be dealing with unhealthy or even abusive relationships as well. So a little bit about us. I'm Jen, the Community Partnerships and Public Education Coordinator at KSACC, the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center. And with us today is also Jennifer, who is one of our counselors at the center. She works with both kids and adults, and she's also our counseling programs manager. And she has a lot of experience working with kids and families who have had experiences of abuse or assault, and so she's going to be helping to co-facilitate the Q&A today. She's got a lot of great knowledge to share with us about these topics. So a couple little housekeeping things, just to keep your microphones muted until the end of the presentation, just so that we don't have any background noise. And as I mentioned, keeping your camera off, that way you won't be in the recording. If you don't care if you're in the recording though, you're certainly welcome to turn it on. And at the end, we can go into more of a conversational space once we finish the recording. So you can keep your questions till the end. If you have any like clarifying questions though, as I'm going, you're welcome to put them in the chat, or even just unmute yourself and be like, hey, I'm a bit lost, or you know, if there's something that you want me to answer right then and there, that's totally fine. And then remembering to, when we are going into a Q&A, to just be mindful of confidentiality. So not discussing your kids or other people's kids in ways that people would know who you're talking about. I also want to acknowledge before we start that we are meeting today, or at least I am presenting to you today, from the traditional unceded territory of the Kamloops Secwepemc people on Secwepemc Gulu. I've been a guest here for almost 12 years. And I am just continually grateful to be living on this land, and grateful to the people who've been taking care of it since the beginning, and continually trying to be mindful of how I am living in this place, and in relationship with its caretakers, and what my role is as a guest here. So today we're going to be talking about healthy relationships. And so we're going to start by kind of contrasting different types of relationships, and then what health looks like and what unhealthy looks like in different kinds of relationships. We're going to talk about a little bit about communication strategies for good relationships. So thinking about ways that we might be able to make some of our relationships better. We're also going to talk about some of the ways that there might be certain relationships the communication strategies aren't going to help with. And so kind of contrasting some of those ideas. And then we're going to look at how to be a support person. So helping out someone in your life who might be dealing with either unhealthy or even abusive relationships. I'm not going to go through all of this because we've talked about it in the previous two sessions, but just a little bit about the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center, which is the organization that Jennifer and I are a part of. And we provide counseling and advocacy services for people who've experienced sexualized violence. And that also includes any form of gender-based violence. So violence that's targeted at or in response to a person's gender or gender identity, and is used to control or humiliate them. And so this includes as well domestic violence and intimate partner violence, as well as stalking and harassment and child abuse and all of those types of things. Another part of our programming is our 24/7 AntiViolence Line, and this line is operated by local volunteers and staff who are trained to respond to crisis and provide emotional support, as well as connecting people with resources in the community. And I always like to share this at the beginning of a presentation, because today we're going to be talking about some heavy stuff, talking about relationship violence and unhealthy relationship behaviors. And sometimes this can be triggering for people, whether it's because of your own past experience or even just concern for people in your life. It can be really normal in a conversation like this to feel yourself a little bit unsettled or upset. And so it's a really good idea to have a plan in place for after you've watched something like this, whether it's that you're going to maybe go for a walk when we're done, or call a friend to talk to, or even just set aside a bit of time to journal or process. And then if you feel like you need someone to talk to as well, this line is a good number to call if you're looking to get some support, or perhaps to be connected to some resources in the community. If you're realizing like, oh yeah, that kind of brought stuff up for me that maybe you didn't know was unresolved, this line is a good place to reach out to. And I'm going to share it again at the end as well. And again, just to normalize the idea that if you are feeling sort of unsettled or a little blue or any kind of even angry after watching this presentation, that's completely normal. And just a reminder to take care of yourself. So I wanted to start by looking at what different types of relationships we might think about when we're thinking about, especially for kids or youth. Because a lot of the times when we're talking about healthy and unhealthy relationships, we're thinking about intimate partners. But of course, there's a whole spectrum of relationships that a person has in their life, and all of those can exist either to some degree more healthy or unhealthy. And so it's important that we think about all of those relationships and not just intimate partners, because sometimes it can be overlooked, like especially in friendships and things like that, if there are degrees of disrespect or unhealthy relationships happening. And so a big relationship system for kids, of course, is their families. So that might be their siblings, parents or caregivers, grandparents, and extended family. And of course, this might be biological family, or it could be chosen family or foster family, adopted family. But obviously, usually family is playing a pretty big role in youth's lives. And then, of course, friends are a huge one for kids. And so again, friends are kind of on a spectrum, like they're sort of best friends and people you spend a whole lot of time with. Some people kind of come in and out of your life, or it's a bit more tumultuous on and off again. And then there are friends who are just kind of like, they're the people that you see at work or people that you see at school, but not necessarily like in your really close circle. And then, of course, romantic partners. And so that might be looking at monogamous relationships, or where two people are non-monogamous, where there's an understanding between people that there are more than two people involved in a relationship. So whether that's having relationships with more than one person or more than two people in a relationship. So just being mindful that there can be different configurations than just this standard of two people, and especially just the standard of a guy and a girl. Because of course there can be same or different genders involved in any type of romantic relationship as well. And I think that is also important when we're talking about healthy relationships or abusive relationships, because we often, and with good reason, because of course we know that in a lot of abusive relationships, the perpetrator is a male partner and the survivor is a female partner. But we also know that it doesn't always go that way, and that there can be abuse in same-sex relationships as well. And so it's important that we don't exclude that from the conversation so that people aren't being overlooked. And then there are just all kinds of other relationships that a person can have, like with their teachers, bosses, different mentors, caseworkers, or people that they're involved with in any kind of programs or institutions that they're a part of. And so I just wanted to kind of work through thinking about these different layers. Oh yeah, and then of course classmates and workmates, so people that you may or may not have any kind of relationship with outside of just being in the same place with them, doing the same thing from day to day. And then community members, so anyone you would kind of interact with in a semi-regular way. And so I just wanted to run through that because I think it's important when we think about relationships to think about all of the different things that that can mean, and so that we don't just get narrowed into thinking about certain relationships and the health of those. And of course, the closer you are to a person, the more time you're spending with them, the more intimately involved you are with them in terms of like if you live together, if your finances are connected or things like that, then obviously relationship health becomes a lot more important. Like it's a lot more important that there's mutual respect and nonviolence and good communication between siblings or roommates or intimate partners than there is with like someone you just see at work from time to time. But I think that it's worth thinking about those different layers and all of the ways as well that we interact with people in a way that's respectful and kind of understanding that we have an impact on all of the people that we interact with in our lives. And so I wanted to share this short video that talks about kind of different aspects of what makes a relationship healthy or unhealthy. And so I'm gonna switch my share over here. Just want to make sure my right. Let me know if the sound doesn't come through.
One Love teaches the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationship behaviors because everyone can benefit from learning how to love better. 10 signs of an unhealthy relationship. If you're seeing any of these 10 unhealthy signs in your relationship, don't ignore them. Understanding these signs can help identify a toxic relationship before it becomes dangerous or abusive. Intensity. When someone expresses very extreme feelings and over-the-top behavior that feels overwhelming. Possessiveness. When someone is jealous to a point where they try to control who you spend time with and what you do. Manipulation. When someone tries to control your decisions, actions, or emotions. Isolation. When someone keeps you away from family, friends, and other people. Sabotage. When someone purposely ruins your reputation, achievements, or success. Belittling. When someone does and says things to make you feel bad about yourself. Guilting. When someone makes you feel responsible for their actions or makes you feel like it's your job to keep them happy. Volatility. When someone has a really strong, unpredictable reaction that makes you feel scared, confused, or intimidated. Deflecting responsibility. When someone repeatedly makes excuses for their unhealthy behavior. Betrayal. When someone is disloyal or acts in an intentionally dishonest way. 10 signs of a healthy relationship. A healthy relationship does not mean a perfect relationship, but we can all strive to love better by practicing these 10 healthy behaviors. Comfortable pace. When the relationship moves at a speed that feels enjoyable and comfortable for each person. Trust. Confidence that your partner won't do anything to hurt you or ruin the relationship. Honesty. You can be truthful and candid without fearing how the other person will respond. Independence. Having the space to be yourself outside of the relationship. Respect. You value one another's beliefs and opinions and love the other person for who they are. Equality. The relationship feels balanced and everyone puts the same effort into the success of the relationship. You feel like your needs, wishes, and interests are just as important as the other person's. Kindness. You're caring and empathetic to one another and provide comfort and support. Taking responsibility. Owning your actions and words. You avoid placing blame and you can admit when you've made a mistake. Healthy conflict. Openly and respectfully discussing issues and confronting disagreements non-judgmentally. Fun. You enjoy spending time together and you bring out the best in each other. The best way to learn about love is through One Love. For more information about One Love and the signs of healthy and unhealthy relationships, visit joinonelove.org.
Bring this back up. So I think that the video does a good job of kind of talking through some pretty important aspects of both unhealthy and healthy. And I like that they frame it as like thinking about not only ways of thinking about what you're experiencing, but also how are you in relationships? Because a lot of the times when we're talking about relationship health, we're sort of warning people of what to watch out for in a relationship, but we're not often talking to the people who might be perpetuating those kinds of behaviors in relationships. And so I think it's also important that, especially again, when we're talking to youth, not just telling them how to watch out for unhealthy behaviors in their partner, but also just asking them to be mindful about how they're showing up in relationships as well. I also found this checklist for sort of looking at relationship health, and I'll link this when I post the video, so it'll be in the video description below. And it's just sort of a checklist of looking at like what kind of behaviors are happening in a relationship that might make it healthy or unhealthy. And I wanted to mention too, like something that we had kind of talked about last time when we were talking about boundaries and consent, is that we're going to talk a little bit in a moment too about communication strategies for maybe improving some relationship health. But there's a difference between unhealthy relationships that can be worked through and sort of improved with both people putting intention in, and relationships that are abusive. And so in situations where both people want to work on making it better, like they said in that video, right? Like conflict is okay, but it has to be healthy conflict that's still respectful and nonviolent. And so, as we talked about with boundaries, with any kind of strategies to improve relationship health, it's only going to work if both people are invested in actually making that happen. And you can have the best boundary setting in the world and the best communication skills in the world, but if the other person is choosing to use violence, and that might not even be physical violence, but verbal, emotional, or psychological violence as well, then that's not a reflection of your communication strategies or your boundary setting. That's the other person's choice to use violence. And so I think that it's important to keep that in mind, because sometimes when we talk about trying to work on relationships, then just like with trying to set boundaries, sometimes that can be weaponized against people as like, if you had just, tried to make it work, then that wouldn't have happened. But sometimes there's certain situations and abusive relationships where that's not going to be the case. And so then it's going to be looking at other strategies to either leave the relationship or taking other steps to ensure your safety within that relationship. And so today I want to be kind of thinking about relationships on a spectrum. So not necessarily just a dichotomy between like a good relationship and abusive relationship, but sort of where there might be room for improvement in relationships, especially when we're thinking about youth and like they're just developing their relationship skills. And so teaching them how to be more healthy in relationships. But I wanted to just chat a little bit more first about kind of recognizing abusive relationships. And so we're going to look at this model of the cycle of violence, which is, again, not what every abusive relationship looks like. So an abusive relationship might not have all of these dynamics and it could still be abusive. And then also just recognizing that this, again, does use gendered language. And as I was saying before, we do know that that's not always what that looks like, because there can be abuse in same-sex relationships as well. And there can be situations where men are being abused. And so while these things aren't as common, I think it's also really important that we don't erase them completely, because then people who are in abusive situations can be overlooked and can feel sort of stigmatized in reaching out for help. And so in this cycle of violence, what we see is kind of starting off with this honeymoon phase where everything's great. Everything's almost like too good to be true often when relationship is starting off. And so then the other person is feeling like really swept off their feet, really excited. They kind of talked about that intensity in the One Love video. Sometimes it can be a bit like that, like almost an overwhelming amount of love. But then slowly over time, the tension kind of builds, and there might be more sort of anger or violent behavior, which will then culminate in some sort of explosive fight, which again may or may not include physical violence, because there are many other forms of violence that are just as damaging to people. And then that will also often be followed by denial or excuses, kind of saying like, you've made me do this, or if you hadn't done such and such, then I wouldn't have acted that way. Then the person who is being abused often blames themselves. And then often this sort of honeymoon phase will start all over again. There'll be lots of apologies, lots of promises that it'll never happen again. But then over time, the tension starts building up again. And this cycle often just repeats and sort of gets more intense or violent over time. And so like this is an example of a case where the person who's being abused in this situation isn't going to fix this with better boundary setting and better communication. And so, if you recognize this as a cycle that you may be in, or maybe have been, or maybe something that you see someone in your life or a child or a youth that you care for is in a cycle like this, then we're going to talk a little bit about some strategies for supporting someone in that situation. And again, if you're recognizing this for yourself, this is a great time to reach out to KSACC or some other community resources to think about how you might want to approach going forward. So this is a good, I know we're not that far in, but I think after talking about that kind of cycle and violence in depth is kind of a nice time to just center ourselves. So taking a moment to check in, taking a moment to take a breath, a moment for me as well. And just recognizing that it's totally okay to have a reaction to talking about abusive and unhealthy relationships. But now we're gonna flip it and we're gonna talk about the components of healthy relationships and how we can think about these things and think about teaching some of these aspects to the kids in our lives. So self-awareness and knowing your needs is an important component. We talked about this a bit last time when we were talking about consent and boundaries. And so an important part of knowing what your boundaries are is sort of knowing what your own needs are in relationship and also just for yourself. And so knowing to ask for the space that you need, or the kinds of things that you need in relationship, or from a partner or from a friend for that matter. And then the boundaries, which kind of go hand in hand with that. So again, it's going to be easier to ask for what you need if you have a sense of what that is. Having empathy for your friends or partners, the people in your life, is really important for healthy relationships, so that we're thinking about the other person and not just our own needs, and finding that balance between looking out for ourselves and asking for our own boundaries to be met, and also understanding what our friends and partners need and want from us as well. Truth and honesty is, of course, a huge one, because I think we often get this model of relationships from media and the culture of sort of playing mind games. And again, especially I think for heterosexual romantic relationships, there's all these ideas about, women playing hard to get, or these ways of almost playing a role that you're supposed to play, where if people can just be open and honest about what they want and need in relationships right from the beginning, then that's going to build that trust, which is going to foster a lot more healthy communication and relating to one another. Allowing space is really important for healthy relationships. And again, this is friendships and family relationships just as much as intimate relationships, where people need to have space to do their own thing, to be their own person, especially for young people who are just figuring themselves out. As much as their friends and partners can be really important to them, it's also important that they have that time to be spending figuring themselves out. Mutual respect, which of course sort of goes along with empathy. So understanding how that person wants to be treated, and treating them respectfully, acknowledging their ideas, not making fun, sort of all of those things again that they talked about in the video. Appreciation for your partner. I think that especially when we've been with someone for a while, it can be easy to sort of get a bit nitpicky, or you can just sort of forget what it is that you really love about your friends or your partner. And so taking that time to appreciate them and voice that appreciation. Nonviolence, of course. And again, when I talk about nonviolence, it's not just not being physically violent, but not being emotionally violent or verbally violent, or even just approaching situations in a way with like a lot of hostility, is really important for people to feel safe in relationships. A willingness to change and grow is really important for anyone involved in a relationship. So again, like friendships or families or partners, everybody's always changing and growing. Ideally, this is, sort of what we're doing throughout our lives. And so letting your relationships change, which is the last thing, and those two things kind of go hand in hand. Understanding that the person that you started this relationship with, no matter what the relationship is not going to be that same person a few years down the road. And so how will you change and respond to one another and allow each other to grow, and allow the relationship to change, and to have the trust that that'll be okay, or that some relationships end. And so that is also a thing that is on the table, and that no one is being asked to stay in a relationship longer than they would want to just for the sake of the other person. And so, as I mentioned, I wanted to just talk a little bit about some communication skills that can be helpful for healthy relationships, because I was thinking about, the whole idea with this is to be thinking about how we can talk to kids and young people about healthy relationships. But a lot of the time, we have never been taught how to have healthy relationships, how to communicate well. And so I think that, as with all of this stuff, it starts with understanding how we are utilizing these skills in our own lives, so that we're not only telling kids, like, here's how you have a healthy relationship, we're modeling those things to them as well. And so, there's a lot that can be said about healthy relationships. And I think too, if you want to kind of learn more, like a lot of what I'm talking about in this comes from the principles of nonviolent communication, which again is not just about the absence of physical violence, but being nonviolent and really intentional in your communications everywhere you go, and with everyone you meet. And so if you want to learn more about that, I've also put a website for nonviolent communication there as well. So one of the big things is using I statements. And what that means is like starting your sentences with I feel, or I want, or I need. And this can be a huge paradigm shift in communication in terms of framing things in a way that doesn't blame the other person, but just tells them that this is what's happening for me. So instead of saying like, you made me feel this way, whatever, it's framing it like, I feel like this when you do this. And so helping the person understand that what you're telling them is a reflection of your experience gives them a lot more room to then understand where you're coming from and why you're telling them that, rather than just sort of jumping into blame, where then a person can get defensive, and it's a little bit harder to want to approach that conversation if a person right out of the gate is feeling blamed. And so I'm a big fan of I statements, just in terms of how much they can change the dynamic. And I think also that when you're coming to a conversation from a place of I'm feeling this way, it can also help you stay grounded and calm too, because I think also when we go into a conversation, starting off with maybe blaming or accusing the other person and coming more from like feeling really angry or outraged, then we're also starting kind of at an already pretty like accelerated place, which isn't usually a good start to a healthy and productive conversation. And then the flip side of that is listening actively to the person who you're speaking to. So that means like listening to understand them rather than listening to respond. So really thinking about what they're saying and trying to use that empathy and understanding to really hear where they're coming from and understand their experience, which again is helpful if they're telling you, if they are also utilizing these skills, and so telling you what their experience is and sharing that with you so that you can then understand where they're coming from. And this can also involve paraphrasing, so sort of saying back to them what you hear them saying and checking in that you made sure you understand them. Because of course, I'm sure we've all had the experience in a relationship where you're in a conflict with someone, and by the time you finally talk it through, you realize that a lot of it was just misunderstanding. Either you didn't understand them or they didn't understand you. And so taking that time to really just say like, this is what I hear you saying, is that right? And you can find out that you were off base. And so if we're just going on assumptions, then sometimes we can miss some important parts of what's going on for the other person. And then I think also really important is if you are in a heated conversation with someone that you're trying to work through, again, like thinking back to that video, conflict is okay as long as it's healthy conflict. And so if you're feeling really overwhelmed in a conversation, or again, like if a person is feeling like their anger is kind of getting the best of them, just asking for some time to cool down and to start up again later, maybe when you've had some time to go for a walk or sort of clear your mind and in a better place to have that conversation. So again, like this is just a very sort of brief overview of some communication skills that can be helpful in relationships. But I think like these are great things that we can be teaching to young people as well, so that they have an idea of where to start when they need to have important conversations with the people in their lives. So then other ways to think about teaching kids about healthy and unhealthy relationships. So as we talked about before, sort of modeling good communication in your own relationships, teaching them about the signs of healthy and unhealthy relationships. And so that might be like sharing the video that we watched or that checklist that we looked at, and just kind of assessing. And again, like really thinking about not just their relationship, like their intimate relationships, but their friendships. Are their friendships healthy or unhealthy? How do they feel when they're in a situation where maybe some of those behaviors are present? And how does that let them know about the health of that relationship? Create space where kids can come to you with their issues. And we've talked about this in the last two presentations as well. So much of it is about creating a foundation where kids feel safe coming to you to talk to things that are important to them. And I think that sometimes as adults, we can sort of write off kids' concerns about their friendships and think like, oh, that's just, kid drama and all of that. But friendships especially are so important to kids. And so I think that if we take them seriously and consider their concerns with their friendships with empathy, then down the road, if they're in other relationships that are unhealthy, they know that they can come to us to talk about those things and that they are going to be taken seriously and listened to. Fostering self-esteem and emotional and social competence and self-awareness. So again, these are kind of all things we've been talking about since the first session, and kind of how this all comes together, that when kids have that emotional and social competence, so they understand how they're feeling, they understand about how interacting with people respectfully and kindly feels, both as the person who is experiencing those good behaviors, and maybe for them to understand what it's like for them if they're acting in ways that are disrespectful or harmful to other people. So it's kind of just that awareness of self and awareness of others that's going to help them be able to navigate these things and recognize them early. And then, as I'm often talking about, is talking about stuff that you see in media. So in shows and movies, when there are opportunities to bring up reflections on relationships that you see in the shows that you're watching or the movies that you're watching. Because again, like, there are lots of opportunities to point out when unhealthy relationships are being modeled. Because I think that that is a trope that we see a lot, especially like, yeah, in some of these romantic comedies and things like that. But then there are also opportunities to talk about really good relationships. Like, I'm just recently watching Parks and Recreation for the first time, and like, one of the things I love about that show is there are two female characters who are really good friends, and it's just such a great model of like a really healthy friendship where they're very supportive of each other and very kind and very loving and kind of hold each other accountable. And so I think that, when we see things like that, bringing it up, like, what is it about this relationship that looks like a healthy relationship to you? Or like, what do you think it's like being in a relationship like that? And so having those conversations in a really low stakes environment can be helpful to kind of start opening up that conversation. So I'm going to show another short video now. Oops. And this is just, it's kind of going through like a teen dating relationship that kind of evolves into being abusive, and just kind of looking at also what being a support person can look like for a friend in that situation. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. So I'm going to switch again.
Hey, my name's Kaya, and I'm a black fella from Victoria. I just want to tell you about me and this guy I've been hanging with. His name's Scott, and I love him. Well, I think I love him. It's just that, it's kind of gone a bit weird lately. So, I first met him when I was playing netball, right? We were at the Netball and Football Carnival, which was in town last October. He's not Corey, but he's like best mates with my cousin Alice's boyfriend. Scott is so hot. They reckon he's had a six-pack since forever. And he has these amazing blue eyes, like I can't even. Jasmine said he couldn't stop looking at me. And since I've sorted my eyebrows out, the girls reckon I'm looking pretty fierce. I didn't talk to him or anything, but Scott found me on Instagram and DM'd me. We started Snapchatting each other every day and we got our streak up to like 66. Then, when we'd meet up, he'd be real charming, like call me bae, and was always holding my hand and saying how pretty I am. One day though, Scott saw me hanging with my brother Danny and a couple of our cousins. We've got the biggest mob, hey, so there's always family around. These fellas were travelling through town, so Danny and I went back to the park to just hang with them. Next time I saw Scott though, he was being quiet and sooky, asking why I was hanging out with the other guys. I tried to tell him about family, but he didn't want to hear it. He said that I should change my Instagram to private. He reckons too many guys are liking my pics and says that I should delete them. Same with any guys on my Snapchat. Which I don't think is fair, but Scott's all like if I loved him, I'd do it. And I really do love him. He's always buying me chocolate and saying that he loves me. So I did. He was cool for a bit, but then he started throwing shade at my friends. Reckoned they were annoying and stupid and that I shouldn't hang out with them. He also started saying that he hated my clothes and that I looked like a hoe when I wore my new gold hoops. Then, just a couple of weeks ago, Scott and I had a full-on fight outside my auntie's house. It started because Scott reckoned my mum and dad were hopeless because they were always getting me to look after my little brothers. I told him I liked doing it, but he just kept on at me, saying I wasn't spending enough time with him. Jasmine was across the road and she saw us fighting. I was so shamed that I didn't even reply when she sent me a text asking if I was okay. Jazz is my BFF, but I just don't want to talk about it. I feel like I'd cry if she asked me how I was. I'm so upset and confused. I just don't know what to think or do right now. Hello?
Oh, hey, you picked up. Hey, have you done that maths revision yet? I'm struggling, hey.
Yeah, same.
Um, so I just want to ask, like, are you all right, sis? It's just that I heard you and Scott yelling the other day, and you didn't reply to my message, so I just want to know that you're all right.
Yeah.
Like, I know you really like Scott. He's hot and he's funny and nice, but me and Danny have heard how he's been talking to you lately, and I just don't want you to feel bad, because you know that you slay, right? Like, you should be feeling good all the time.
Thanks, Jess.
Kaya, I love you. You're my bestie, so please just talk to me if you need to.
It's good to chat. Find someone you trust, like your family, friends, or teachers, to have a yarn. For more information on where you can get.
So again, I think that video does a really good job of both showing kind of that cycle where the relationship kind of starts off really good and positive, and kind of slowly over time, like little red flags start showing up. And then also just how the friend responds in a really good way of just reaching out and kind of saying like, I'm here for you, not really going off about this guy's garbage and all of that. And we're going to kind of talk a little bit about some of those things, because it's often easy to feel like we need to take sort of a heavy-handed approach when we see someone that we love in an unhealthy relationship. But because people are often already so isolated, it's usually a better approach to kind of just let them know that we're there for them, and to be focusing more on sort of the things that we're seeing in the relationship than about the person, which can kind of get them defensive. But we're going to chat a little bit more about that in the coming slides. So I wanted to talk about how to be a support, and first of all, to think about how kids and youth can support each other, because we know that very often if kids are experiencing any kind of abuse in relationships, or an assault of any kind, then often the first person they're going to tell is their friend. And so I think for a lot of us, we don't necessarily know what to do if someone comes and tells us that they've experienced something like that. So equipping youth for how to help support each other can be really helpful. So we want to think about it in three different sort of points that we want to hit if someone discloses to us that they've experienced violence. And that's going to be listen, believe, and then empower and support. So listening is just really like letting the person tell you what they want to tell you and when they're ready. And so not pushing for more information, not asking a lot of questions or interjecting or like trying to get details, but just letting them tell you what they're ready to tell you. And then asking them if they're safe and how you can help. And that's really important for youth, because, if they're telling a friend, maybe they need to be connected to an adult or somebody else who can help them out. So the next thing is believing them. So again, like just letting the person know that you believe what they're telling them. And this can be a point too about limiting questions, is that sometimes it kind of can feel like you're interrogating them to get the truth out of them. But really often when people decide to come forward about something like this, it's often not easy and people are worried about not being believed. So really just letting the person know that you're glad that they told you and that you believe what's happened, and not downplaying their experience or their reaction to their experience. Because I think that can be another thing that happens too. People can be worried that someone's reaction will be like, oh, well, it's not that bad, or maybe you took it out of context. But just really understanding that that person has had their experience and their reaction to their experience is valid, and just being a place for them to talk about what's happened. And then letting them know that you are there for them and that you're still their friend. So again, like we saw in that video, she just sort of called her up and said, like, I'm here if you need me. You can come and talk anytime. So again, like not putting that pressure on and letting the other person be in control of what happens next. And so asking them what they want to do and not necessarily assuming that this is what you would do if it was you, and so you're going to take those steps for them, but just helping them to understand that there are resources available if they want them. And again, for youth, like letting them know that they can help connect them to a safe adult in their life. Hopefully they have a person like that, and that might be like a parent or a caregiver. Maybe it's a caseworker that they trust and work with, someone at their school, but having adults to go to if it's a situation where the person who's disclosing feels unsafe and needs someone else to go to, then the best next step is probably getting an adult involved. So then thinking about maybe you are that adult, the fact that you're in these sessions, and so obviously concerned about kids in your life and wanting to be a support person. It might be that kids come to you with an issue that their friend is experiencing and looking for some help. And so again, it's going to be very similar with that structure of listen, believe, and empower and support, but there are a few things that are going to be a little bit different. And so again, like we've talked about before, it's that being the person that a child comes to with this information starts sort of long before that ever happens, by laying that groundwork, like we've talked about, of taking a child's concerns seriously as when it comes to relationships or anything else, so that they know that you're the kind of person that they can come to when something's happened and they need advice and support. And again, when they're sharing their story with you, not asking a lot of questions, not rushing them, but asking them if they're safe and asking them how you can help. Believing is going to look pretty much the same, letting them know that you take their concerns seriously and not downplaying their experience or asking a lot of questions that kind of look like interrogation. The empower and support part is going to look a little bit different. So usually when we talk about this, we're talking about adults, just in terms of talking about responding to a disclosure of abuse or assault. And so we generally take the tact of like letting that person be in charge of what happens, letting them kind of take the reins on what they want to do. But when we're talking about kids, if the violence that they disclose to you is happening in their home and they're under 18, then that is a situation where, just as a citizen of BC, then you have a duty to report that to the Ministry of Children and Family Development. So if you ever have a reason to believe that there's abuse or neglect happening to a child in their home, whether by the parents or that the parents aren't doing anything to stop it, then that is a mandatory reporting. And so it's hard because we always want to put survivors in the driver's seat, but we also need to make sure that kids are safe. And so you can have a conversation with them about the fact that you're going to have to make a report if that feels like the right thing to do in that situation. And this is a time where it could be really good to reach out to somebody to ask how to go ahead with that. So that might be reaching out to somebody at SCFS, or you could call KSACC as well and potentially get some advice on what your next steps might be. Because again, like, we don't expect you, just because a kid comes to you to tell you that this happened, we don't expect you to necessarily be an expert or know exactly what to do, but more so to understand that there are places that you can reach out to for support to figure out what your next steps are. But to think about in that moment, just sort of staying calm, staying present with the kid, asking them what kind of support they want, and then figuring out what your next steps might be, knowing that there are community resources you can reach out to for help. And then, so this is kind of thinking about if this happens with a kid who isn't your kid or the kid that you're caretaking, because it's going to be a little bit different and a little bit more potentially emotional and challenging if it is your own child or a child that you really care about. So I wanted to talk about that separately, just in terms of some of the weight that might be involved with that. So first, just thinking about like watching for signs of unhealthy behavior. So if you're worried that your kid might be in a relationship And again, like this can be an abusive friendship, a roommate situation that's really unhealthy for them, or an intimate partner where you feel like you're starting to notice some of those red flags, like maybe they're not spending time with family like they used to, or you don't hear them talking about their other friends as much anymore, and they're all just really kind of focused on this one person. And if you're noticing these things, like again, as we've talked about a lot of times, just keeping those communication lines open, letting them know that you can come to them to talk about it, and not pushing too much too fast about your concerns. I mean, unless if you really feel like it's a safety concern, then of course, like doing something that's a little bit more quick and to the point might be important. But sometimes keeping those communication lines open is going to be the most important thing to do. And again, just like we talked about before, if they come to you with problems in their relationship, listening to them and believing, and not diminishing their experiences or their reactions. Focusing on the behavior, not the person. And again, like I think that video did a good job of this, where she sort of affirms, like, I know that Scott's this really great guy and he's all these things, but also like the way he's treating you isn't okay. Because it's often easy for people who are in relationships that have become abusive. They still love that person because often it has started off with a really loving relationship. And so they know that that person is capable of that. And so to have friends or family sort of talking about the person and, really saying bad things about them can really put the person on the defensive. And so focusing instead on the behaviors that you're seeing or the changes that you're seeing in the person that you're talking to can be sort of a better approach. And then not blaming or judging either the person for, the child that you're talking to for being in that relationship, or for not leaving, or for any of those things. Like, this might be a learning opportunity for them, but in the moment, they just need you to be there to support them, and help them work through what they're dealing with. And letting them know that you support them, even if you are concerned about the relationship, so that your concerns about the relationship aren't going to override the fact that you care about them. And again, I think that it can be sometimes this idea that we have to take like a tough love approach to people who we see who are in bad relationships, like kind of saying, well, you need to leave that person, or like, then we won't have a relationship anymore. And the problem with that is that people in abusive relationships are already often really isolated. And so isolating them further can kind of make that worse. And that can be really, really challenging, especially if you are seeing someone in a relationship that you can see is clearly abusive, and you are really worried about them and you don't know what else to do. But often pushing that person out of your life is going to make things that much harder for them if they've now lost their connection. And with that too, like thinking about this can be really, really hard on the person who is witnessing this in someone that they care about, and especially if that person is their child or a child that they really care about. And so really thinking about getting support for yourself as well. So having someone to talk to, and that might be like someone in your life that you love and trust. But then, also being mindful about like confidentiality, or, respecting the youth that you're talking about. And so that might also look like, getting support from somewhere like KSACC, or counseling, or some kind of agency that can support you, that maybe is removed from the family. So they don't necessarily have opinions or thoughts about what to do, but can just be there to support you and listen to you, because this is a really challenging situation to be in. And so just recognizing that, like, you don't have to carry all of that on your own. And then if it makes sense, you might think also about assembling a team of people. So again, if you're talking about your child, maybe they're not going to take your concerns as seriously as they might take, like their trusted aunt or their cousin or a good friend of theirs. And maybe those people are seeing these patterns or behavioral changes in that person as well. And so kind of being a team is not about, sort of piling on the person or like staging an intervention, but just letting that youth know that they have a support network of people who love them and are concerned for them and care about them. And the other thing this does is it creates a support network for you as well, so that you don't feel like you're the only one who's noticing what's happening or trying to support that person. And so that you have some backup if you're dealing with this kind of a situation. And so we talked about, in that empower and support sort of portion of the response. So wanting to have some resources that you can connect a person with. And I've created a little one-page handout on sort of responding to a disclosure. And so it lists those steps of listen, believe, important, empower, and support, and also has these support options as well. And I've just put a few on here. So the KSACC AntiViolence Line, the Kids Help Phone. Kids Help Phone website is also really awesome because they list like a whole bunch of different issues that kids might be dealing with. So like resources for virtuous LGBTQ youth, or stuff about if youth are thinking about suicide, unhealthy relationships, bullying, like all these different kinds of things where kids can go, and youth, and look at those things kind of in a confidential and private way on the website if they don't want a phone. And I believe that you can also text the Kids Help Phone, which is great because, for lots of youth, phoning someone is not going to necessarily be their first choice. And I put the suicide hotline there as well. And then that's the MCFD centralized screening number that you can call if you are worried about a kid in their home being abused or neglected. You can also call SCFS if that is a situation that you're seeing, and talk to them about what you can do. And then I have the KSACC office there as well. And there are lots of other resources that you might refer a person to in this situation. In our first session, of course, we had like that huge list of resources with different 24/7 crisis lines and things like that. So there might be something on there that's a better fit, but just to have a few resources at least to be able to offer to someone if they disclose to you that they are experiencing relationship abuse. And then for the last thing, I really just wanted to talk about taking care of yourself, because we're talking about how to teach kids about healthy and unhealthy relationships. And a lot of the times, like I said at the beginning, this can really bring stuff up for ourselves, like maybe recognizing patterns of unhealthy relationships or even abusive relationships that we've experienced in our own life. And it's so important to be taking the time to think about how we might heal ourselves from those things as we're trying to help the kids that we love not kind of repeat those patterns. And so thinking about, like, are you getting support, and how could you be getting more support? How could you be reaching out to different resources that might be helpful for you when you're navigating, thinking about these things, or just getting more information about how to talk to kids about these things that might be hard for you to talk about, and letting yourself feel your feelings, because I think it's also important to recognize that, like, when we're talking about healthy relationships, or even when we're just talking about trying to teach kids things that they might not, be open to hearing about, that it can be frustrating and it can be difficult and it can be heartbreaking. And so just recognizing that those responses are all okay and that you deserve to be supported through all of that. And again, just like, I think we talked about this at the very first session, is that, like, all of this is difficult, and parenting is extremely challenging, and you're just doing the best you can. Again, I think, like, showing up to a workshop like this, or taking the time to watch the replay, is like a sign that you really care about the kids in your life. And so giving yourself some credit for that, and recognizing that you deserve to be taken care of as well. So that's going to bring us to the end of the me talking portion. So just again, inviting people to take a moment to maybe take a breath, take a sip of water, maybe move your body a little bit. Also, again, if you're watching on the replay, take a moment to do that, knowing that you won't be about to go into conversation as we are here, those of us who are watching live, but just maybe intending some other way to take a moment of caring for yourself. And then we're going to get into a little bit of a Q&A. So I am going to stop the recording now.